All right. Well, today we have Andrew Hammer joining me, and he is working with the Library of Social Science, right? Isn't that the name?
Yeah, actually, I'm working with Dr. Konigsberg, and
Okay.
we're starting we're kind of moving to a new venture
Oh, a new venture.
called,
Okay.
the Foundation for the Study of Political, uh, excuse me, Foundation for the Study of Political Pathopsychology,
Okay.
Psychopathology. I'm sorry.
All right. And what does that mean in a nutshell for
And
folks who
it,
are not familiar with Richard
yeah.
Koenigsberg's work?
In a nutshell, what Richard studies is social psychology,
Mhm.
and specifically the the collective psychology of Nazi Germany, and also of what was going on during World War One. And what he has kind of discovered or seen is that these, you know, he found that in war, we found that there's this almost this law of sacrifice, that people are willing to die, and their willingness to die and kill testifies to this truth of like a political idea of a political entity.
Right.
Um, and one way of putting it is that, quote, the dead and mangled bodies on the field of battle, they testify to the truth of some idea or entity, that which is the cause of the dying or the killing. People cannot conceive that dying or killing occurs in the name of no thing. So that is the first part of what we've kind of been positing over the last couple of years, which is the law of sacrifice. Okay. The second part of that law is that the solidity or the reality of a nation is reinforced by the willingness of soldiers to kill and also to die in its name. The Nazi leader, Rudolf Hess, he often introduced Hitler at his rallies. He stated that the flow of blood confers eternal life. He said, the stream of blood, which for Germany is eternal, the sacrifice of German men for their Volk is eternal. Therefore, Germany will also be eternal.
Yeah.
So, at the core of this is there's this idea that as long as the blood is being shed, the nation continues to live. And this was what was at the center of the Nazi ideology. This idea, the blood was being shed, the nation of Germany continues to live. And, just as Germany would, they were fine to sacrifice the elite SS soldier, they were equally fine for the blood of the lowly Jew. And
Yeah.
Hitler put it this way, and was a very shocking statement when I first read it. He said, if I don't mind sending the pick of the German people into the hell of war without the slightest regret, then naturally I have the right to destroy millions of an inferior race that breed like vermin.
Yeah.
Okay. So, in order to understand this fantasy more deeply, I recently turned to studying how sacrificial death was operating in Japan during the Second World War. This example is probably, well, Japan during the Second World War was probably the most sacrificial nation in the history of the world. Just, with things like the kamikaze pilots and just their focus on suicide attacks.
Yeah.
Uh, Sometimes, I mean, their commitment to death is almost grotesque and is really kind of hard for us to understand in the Western world. And what
Give
was
us an
interesting,
example. Give us an example of a commitment to death that would be hard for us to understand.
okay, well, I'll go. I'll talk actually right about Bushido. Okay, uh, are you familiar with Miyamoto Musashi, the great Japanese swordsman? He's pretty famous. Uh, anyway, he wrote a book called The Book of Five Rings, and it's basically a famous book. And he wrote it at the end of his life to kind of capture the philosophy of his life as a warrior. And what he says is that the way of the warrior is the resolute acceptance of death.
Right.
Okay. Now, there's another book called Hagakure, which is sort of the definitive, or that's the understanding of Bushido, which the Second War emerged out of. And Walter Skaya, he's a culturist. He studies the Japanese culture. He's the author of a book called Japan's Holy War: The Ideology of Radical Shinto ultranationalism. He actually quotes from the book, which really says, well, these are actually the most famous words and really the essence of what the Bushido philosophy is. And what he quotes is, the essence of Bushido is to seek death. This means when a warrior is faced with a choice between life and death, he chooses death.
Yeah.
It's simple as that. To say that death without achieving one's aim is a death in vain, a dog's death, that's the kind of calculating Bushido practiced in the Kyoto area. So the samurai, to the Japanese samurai warrior, death was the goal. It was, superior. It was, it superseded all other military aims.
Right.
And even in pursuit of this goal, the samurai had a word called junshi, and that was a word for a special kind of death, where when the samurai's lord would die, the samurai would follow their lord in death. And and as an example of this, in the 1600s, a shogun, Nabeshima Kachishige, he was the lord of the Saga feudal domain. When he died, 36 of his servants, they followed him in his death, performing seppuku. So that's what I mean by the actual desire to seek death. Because when we talk about the Nazis, both the Nazis and the Germans, they both were waging these wars of conquest. But the Nazis never said their soldiers were seeking death explicitly. Now, they understood in the course of the war, their soldiers would die, as they were attempting to do various military objectives and complete goals. And that's that soldiers even pledged a certain level of obedience unto death, which was part of their oath to the Fuhrer. But they never said explicitly, yes, we are seeking death. Even in America and other Western countries, we accept the fact that soldiers will typically die, and it may even be obvious, to people like, someone like you who sees war a little bit differently than a normal person. But there's no idea in the what I would say, the consciousness of the culture that our soldiers are seeking death. It's a completely foreign thing. Does that make sense?
That they desire to preserve their life. They don't want to run towards death, right?
Yeah. So they're almost completely opposite of us in that aspect. And kind of the way they thought of it is that, by offering their lives for the sake of the emperor, it wasn't really thought of as self-sacrifice. It was referred to kind of casting aside the little self and then living under the august grace of the emperor, so that one could die to the self and return to the one. So anyway, so the conventional way that we in the West, as I said, think about warfare is that it's kind of undertaken with this idea that we want to conquer something, we want resources, we want to win. And soldiers and civilians, they obviously will have, they will die in the process of the war, but we don't think of the actual dying as the objective of the war itself. So from the Western side, how are we supposed to, try to understand this ideology of death, dying, sacrifice that is characterized by Shinto ultranationalism? I think there are a couple clues in some other researchers that kind of lead the Connick's work. And first, Jordan Peterson, he has a really unusual definition of God. He says that we have this hierarchy of values. And at the very top of that hierarchy, at any given moment, that's going to determine what we do. So that's, can be understood as God, that highest value in the hierarchy, even if we don't know which God we are serving. Now, from there, based on his research on terrorism, there's an anthropologist, Scott Atran, and he concludes that humans make their greatest sacrifices, including killing and dying, not only to preserve their own lives or the lives of their children or friends, but for ideas. and he calls those sacred values.
Mhm.
And finally, Königsberg states that, and this goes back to the law of sacrifice, that human beings die and kill in the name of truth. They do that to prove the reality of that idea or ideal, but the nature of the idea or ideal or entity in the name of which those humans are dying and killing is completely fungible. So there's almost something kind of religious going on here. Okay. So to look into this, I was just going to look at take an analysis of the Japanese participation in the Second World War and kind of the role that the emperor played in that. This is a picture of Douglas MacArthur and standing next to Emperor Hirohito. Okay, one of the things I want to emphasize is that during the Second World War, most of the Japanese viewed Emperor Hirohito as God, not a god, but the God, the absolute transcendental being. And that was the first thing I really had to overcome in investigating this, David, because it's, when I look at this picture, it's hard to, as an American, it's very hard for me to look at that picture. I see Hirohito, he's just, he has glasses on. He's an Oriental guy, and he's standing next to like General MacArthur. He's very kind of unassuming. It's difficult for me to like see that as God. So I just wanted to really emphasize that point there. During the war, most of the Japanese, they thought of him as God. Now, after the war, in 1946, the Allies forced the Emperor Hirohito to renounce his divinity. Most of the Japanese were shocked and deeply disturbed when this happened. After all, the justification that they believed for fighting the war and all the suffering the Japanese had endured was based on the assumption that the emperor was divine, that the emperor was God. At the time, Yukio Mishima, an important Japanese author, novelist, playwright, film director, he was writing about Japan's imperial past. He was very consumed by the samurai traditions, and he was profoundly devoted to the idea of the emperor's divinity. And a lot of his writings had to dealt with kind of these samurai traditions of dying for your emperor and this heroic ideal of seeking death. Okay. Now, throughout the Second World War, the emperor he didn't speak. Okay. Now, it was presumed that he was the one, it was in his name that this war was undertaken, even though he didn't actively participate or suggest strategy or any of those other functions you would maybe expect out of your leaders. This was all left to the actual politicians and the generals. And he didn't speak to the Japanese people the entire war. Now, one of the conditions of the surrender was that he was required to speak. And he did, renouncing his divinity. And when he did that, the Japanese heard him for the first time. Now, for Mishima, the emperor as God died when Hirohito broke his silence and spoke in that normal human voice. Mishima, he felt betrayed by Hirohito when he called himself human, that renouncing of the Godhead. Mishima, he didn't blame Hirohito for being a human. What he blamed Hirohito for is rather that he behaved as a human, as kind of like this political animal. In a short story he wrote called Voices of the Heroic Dead, he analyzes the thought processes which led Hirohito to agree to make this proclamation under the instructions and also the pressure of the general headquarters, which is sort of similar to like our Pentagon chief of staffs. After tracing how Hirohito came to make the proclamation, the voices, Mishima's voices, get to this point. And he says, quote, "Only twice in the history of Showa, His Majesty should have been God. We don't know how to say it, but it was his duty as a man to be God. Only in those two occasions, he should have been God in the extreme depths of his being a man, but he failed twice. he remained human when he was most expected to be God. So Mishima is assuming two levels in the humanity of the emperor. One of the levels is the humanity the emperor has on his surface. The other is the humanity that's contained deep in the depths of the emperor. And so the former is susceptible, the one on the surface is susceptible to things like political change, emotions, whims, those sorts of things. The latter is beyond time. It's even, we would say, I mean, it would be immutable or eternal. For Mishima, Hirohito should be blamed for failing to satisfy those who died for the emperor's god. Hirohito had failed in his duty to stick to the emperor's divinity, a duty which he had inherited from 123 emperors before him. When he called himself human, Hirohito actually betrayed all of those emperors before him. Because the people believed all those emperors who existed before him, they represented a single unbroken line since the beginning of the country, actually representing its eternity. In response, Mishima killed himself performing the ritual of seppuku, or disemboweling himself in public. Seppuku, which means cutting belly, is an extremely painful and slow suicide. The samurai would plunge a short sword or dagger into the left side of his abdomen and slice laterally across to the right. This sort of death was an effective way to demonstrate courage, self-control, the strong resolve of the samurai, and also it proved a complete sincerity of purpose. I think you've probably seen this in movies. Anyway, so the question is, why would Mishima do this? What was his purpose? What was the sincere purpose that he was hoping to accomplish with his death? Or, I think from the other, from the law of sacrifice perspective, what reality was he trying to kind of bring back to the world? And in his essay, Mishima's Negative Political Theology, Dying for an Absent Emperor, Yukio Mishima explains this. He says about Mishima, by killing himself, Mishima reenacted the sacrificial deaths for the emperor that occurred during the Second World War. Mishima's suicide is regarded as a major event in the history of Japanese nationalism. With his spectacular suicide, Mishima reminded the post-war Japanese of what they had believed in during the war. It was not just the emperor as a god, but the emperor as God, an absolute and transcendental being. Mishima's theology gives us a clue to understanding the idea that drove many Japanese to sacrificial deaths. This idea of the emperor as God. So, in looking how we could get from the Bushido period to the Second World War, we have to look a little bit at kind of the social and what was going on in Japan in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. One of the things that's very different that we almost take for, well, we do take for granted here is this idea that people are distinct individuals. In Japan at that time, that was virtually unknown. In 1866, the Meiji Restoration restored practical imperial rule under Emperor Meiji. During the next half of the century, Japan went from a feudal society towards that of a centralized nation. They began to industrialize, they began to modernize. And during this period, Japan started beginning to adopt and be introduced more and more to Western ideas, Western production techniques and things like that. In his writings, Sky explains, he explains the writings of Hozumi Yatsuka. Hozumi was a Japanese social theorist of the time, and he really believed that the individual and society could not be separate. And he resolved this I guess, tension between the individual and the society through a concept called godo seijion, or amalgamated existence, or fused existence. And this idea was that the ideal person was one who desired total assimilation into the higher organic totality of society. He also believed that the purpose of morality was to direct individuals to this end, to just complete submergence of their self into the social totality. Now, Hozumi, he considered Enlightenment thought, especially this idea of individualism coming from the West, to be the ultimate ideological threat to the Japanese state. He sought to wage war against this idea that it is possible for humans to exist in the conditions separate from society. He stated that the individual does not exist in isolation, and that it's a mistake to think that society is made up of isolated supporting individuals. At the same time, a Japanese constitutional law scholar, Yoisegi Shinkichi, he was citing Hegel, and he said that the state was not a contractual relationship between individuals, but itself was an individual independent of and superior to all other individuals. Yoisugi conceived of the state as an actual organism. And in kind of following in that, he conceived of the emperor as an actual organ of the state. So in Japan, the emperor was seen sort of as the ultimate source of the national organizational will, or the embodiment of the state. Okay. Because of this, the emperor, and obeying him, well, because of this, obeying the emperor, it wasn't just a moral action or the right thing to do, but it was actually seen as the highest realization of self. Skaya states that to become part of the emperor was to accomplish man's essential being. Now, what happens to the individuals once assimilated into the society? That was a question as a Westerner that I kind of asked about this, and the Japanese considered this. Another theorist, Gaeki Katsuyo, he developed this theory, which was present at the time, called one heart, same body. And the way this kind of manifests, this was very similar to the series we just talked about, this idea that Japan is a nation with basically the mind and the embodiment of it being in the emperor. And what Kaeki says is that individuals annihilated the self in order to completely offer themselves to the emperor. In this way, a person entered into the mystical body of the emperor, and he became fused with society. Kaeki similarly believes that the focus on separation of the individual from the social organism was the greatest threat to the Japanese nation. So, so as we're leading up to the Second World War and through the Mishima suicide, it's not difficult to really see how the sacrifices of the samurai express this idea of seeking death. This gave weight to Bushido, this philosophy of Bushido as a way of truth. So the deaths of the samurai functioned as the verification method of Bushido's way of truth for the Japanese philosophers and social theorists of the late 18th and 19th century. And then during the Second World War, the Japanese army, very captivated by this Bushido philosophy that had kind of been carried into the 20th century, into the 19th century, into the 20th century. They, the Chinese army and the Japanese military was indoctrinated with those ideas. And we can see in the Second World War, the Japanese soldiers enacted the idea of submission to the will of the emperor by actively seeking death, whether it was, from what we typically think about, kamikazes. The Japanese actually had several different attack units, or they called them special attack units. And what we can see after the war, one may suggest that when the emperor renounces identity, that's when the idea of Japan as a social organism died. And the fact that the emperor was no longer conceived as, this transcendental and absolute being, as the god, completely shattered the idea of the Japanese nation. And it was no longer this body fused with an emperor. So what happened was Mishima attempted to revive this idea to prove that it was still true by essentially committing suicide. And he did, for a small time, revive the idea that the nation and everything that was lost during war, that this idea that the emperor was God and that it was noble and the right thing to do to kill ourselves for God. He brought that back into, the consciousness where people saw it. I think, in conclusion, I would say is, to understand what Japan was doing at its core in the Second World War. I think it's best described as that Japan itself was enacting this ritual seppuku. It was spilling its own blood, specifically through special attack units like the kamikazes. And it was doing this to not only to die and join its emperor in death, but to testify to the truth of the emperor is divine and the Japanese nation.
Well, good job. Thank you, Andrew.
Mm-hmm.
So what is in your opinion, why do they think that dying testifies to the truth of their nation?
What?
What is it about dying that is, how does that prove the nation's existence or something?
It proves the nation's existence based on the work that Königsberg has done and the work that Scott Atran has done. Whereas you have the Japanese, they believed the emperor was God, so that was their sacred ideal, or their sacred idea. And as Königsberg says, in the law of sacrifice, when the samurai, by killing himself, the samurai gives basically testimony to his willingness, his absolute willingness to die for the emperor. And the idea being that, like, nobody's like, people just can't comprehend that someone would die for no thing at all. People think that when we see people at war and we think they have to be dying for something. They're not just out there killing themselves. But when we look at, or when I look at what the Japanese actually say and what they say in their philosophies, like right at the core, it's seeking death. It's that the samurai, like, when they have the choice between life and death, they choose death. That's the fantasy. And it doesn't make the nation, like, grow the nation. It's like that's the whole fantasy that Germany had. Like, Germany thought that by killing the people, the nation would grow. Mm-hmm. What we can see here is the Japanese were doing the same thing, except they were more focused on the emperor because the emperor was the nation to them. So it was almost, I think it was almost more religious than, say, what we had going on in Nazi Germany. Because Adolf Hitler was he was the Führer and he was the supreme ruler, but he wasn't God.
Mm-hmm. And so Mishima didn't like it that the emperor wasn't willing to die to keep his emperor God status.
Yeah. He couldn't accept it. Well, he couldn't accept the emperor as not being God. That, like, he really struggled with that. And he felt that the emperor had betrayed he felt that the emperor had betrayed everyone by, like, renouncing his godhood. Almost like he didn't want it, like, it's almost like he was God and then, he just abandoned his people.
So what was the definition of godhood or God in that culture? Do you have
the definition of God in that culture was just seeking death for the emperor? That was the highest ideal, was to die and be fused with the emperor. So, in the way, like, Christians say we want to be, one with Christ, the Japanese would say we want to be one with the emperor. And the way that the military class accomplished that was by killing themselves.
Well, see, what I'm trying to get at is you're saying that Mishima was upset with the emperor because he made a political human calculation to go ahead and renounce his emperor status.
Yes.
And it sounds like what would the alternative would be is fight to the very death, right? Including the
Yeah.
emperor. So that gets back to what Girard says. That's why I said Koenigsberg's work fits right under nicely with what Girard's already built, because he's just really refining the war part, which is good. Because Girard says that the emperor and the king were originally human sacrificial tokens themselves, right? So they were eventually, primordially able to, through lots of time, delay their sacrifice. And so the fact that the emperor was not willing to maintain his divine transcendent role to the point of death destroyed the entire cult of that was built on that, which was that his role is to be the noble sacrifice for the nation when his time has come. But he didn't fulfill it. He, I guess, made a political calculation, right? And then that's
exactly, and and it just that destroyed Mishima.
Right. Well, that destroys all. I don't know why there's a fixation on Japan and Germany, but this is what all nations are using this to some degree, right? Would you not?
Yeah.
This is the point I had with Koenigsberg before, is that this is an issue that all nations require this type of framework to prove themselves, right? I mean, this is, today is the tax deadline for the United States of America. You pay your tithes and offerings to this national body, which maintains its existence by the fact that it's willing to, people say it all the time. The troops died for your right to speak. The troops died. The soldiers died for your right to vote. So you must vote.
Yeah.
The troops died.
Yeah, that's kind of what we're saying.
Your,
and that's exactly what we're saying in the, oh, sorry. Were you saying something? Okay.
Go ahead.
I was saying that's exactly what we were saying in the law of sacrifice is it's that willingness, even like the willingness to give up your money. You know what I mean? The willingness to make sacrifices in the name of an idea or entity gives an actual reality to that entity or a solidity to that reality.
Yeah.
No, I think that is, and I think that's a very deep part of the war mechanism. I think where the place that I see it differ a little bit from Girard is when I look at the Japanese, I don't see the external enemy. Like with the Japanese, like they're killing themselves, and that's very interesting to me. And I struggle to find where's the external, or where's the scapegoat coming in, in the Japanese culture, where like the scapegoat kind of isn't hidden, like they say our philosophy of the warrior is to choose death over life. So how does that, how would you square that with, how does that fit into Girard's ideas?
Well, a lot of times whenever ancient societies would elect candidates for sacrifice, they would elect them by taking them from a rival clan, and enslaving them, but they would always have to get enough insiderness in them by giving them the local foods, local orgies. Even when they would slaughter animals, they would wean the foreign captured animals on the milk. They would give them the milk of the local cows or whatever to make sure that they had the sameness or the localness imbued into the sacrificial candidate prior to sacrificing them. So the scapegoat is not necessarily someone that's wholly outside of the camp. Rather, the scapegoat comes from within the camp. So the notion that Japan would elect a certain class of people to be called the warrior class that would promote their own self-annihilation is a very well-ordered sacrificial machine, as if these people have been bred as sacrificial lambs, so to speak, and to kind of portray the bravery and the courage of the entire nation in the battlefield against their opponents, and if necessary, kill themselves in the process to show the glory of the people. But they were, warrior classes were given their certain caste status, were they not? They were, it wasn't something everybody could be. And in the same token, the emperor was his own class. He was his own
Oh,
set apart. So he's
yeah,
like
he
the
was set
ultimate
completely
lamb.
apart. But I want to emphasize they didn't. You said something about like going to war, and you said and die if necessary. No, they sought to die.
Yeah.
Because the whole idea of seppuku is almost the conclusion of that.
At some point, they didn't seek to die, right? Because they didn't like the bomb being dropped. They didn't ask for another one of those. So obviously they had, you know what I'm saying? Like at some point there was some sense of like, no, this is enough.
Well, there's an there was an element that didn't want to die, but like I would say, like the ritual seppuku, the samurai killing himself. That's almost a good way to see that is that's how the samurai was able to get honor for himself if like he lost. So you'd see in World War II there were soldiers who would commit, harikari or seppuku. Seppuku and harikari are the same thing. And there were soldiers that would do that instead of being captured. And what's happening there is that's this idea of, okay, I didn't die like I was supposed to on the battlefield, so I'm going to die now. So the goal is always death. It's not anything but the death. It's not like, oh, they died if necessary. They like that for them dying was the actual purpose.
But that's how most pagan societies always have structured themselves, right? I mean, the honor of the death in battle, the Norse religion, the Germanic tribes, the honor of dying in battle, the honor of dying in for the nation. Japan seemed to have a very highly refined version of that through the ages, right?
Oh, definitely. And again, the part that sets Japan apart too is the fact
it's
that
still there. It's still kind of there in a vestige, right? Because they have
well, it is still there because we kept it alive. Yeah, the West has kept it alive.
No, but I'm saying the Japanese version of this still kind of exists in their society because you have to, when you're a company man, you have to stay out all night and go to the after work socializing and meals with your coworkers, and you have to socialize a long time. You have to work long hours. It's very honor based, and if you bring shame or disrepute, there's a high pressure that can lead to a high suicide rate, which is a kind of automatic self-sacrificial machine.
Yeah.
Like you've refined the sacrificial mechanism so well through the years that you don't have to have somebody else do it to you. You just go out to the forest
do it yourself.
And do it yourself. And I think that's kind of what was going on there with that seppuku.
Yeah, that's part of it. There's a lot I think that has to do with the need to be one with God, or or the inability to handle the separation between oneself and the divine, because this is all done to kind of be unified with their Lord one way or another, usually in death. And I think that's an important aspect of the mechanism that's driving that. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Okay. I think anything else. I think that's about everything. We're getting close to one.
Yeah. I really appreciate your time, Andrew. Where can people continue? Do you have a website or email list for Richard and you?
Yeah, it's the Foundation for the Study of Political Psychopathology.org.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And let's do something more and expand this in the future. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, we can. Yeah, I think that'd be definitely great. I enjoy collaborating with you, and I know Richard also enjoys collaborating with you.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.